Hello there, and I'm so glad you found your way here. Tonight, we are going to travel far away from the noise of the everyday to a place of ultimate stillness and profound majesty. We are drifting toward the gentle, sweeping slopes of Mount Fuji, a timeless and silent guardian standing proudly beneath a vast canopy of cosmic wonder. Its perfect, snow-capped peak has rested peacefully for centuries, watching the silver stars wheel across the endless indigo sky. Before we begin our gentle ascent into the quiet, starlit mysteries of this majestic, slumbering giant, please take a soft moment to gently like this video and subscribe to our channel. It is a small, quiet gesture that helps us continue to craft these serene sanctuaries for you to rest safely within. As you settle even deeper into your warmest, softest blankets, let the outside world fade away into nothing more than a gentle, distant hum. It is softly replaced by the whispering, fragrant winds of the ancient mountain, carrying the scent of pine and cool snow. The air here is pure, crisp, and wonderfully calm. The night is entirely yours, and there is absolutely nothing left for you to do but simply drift. So, take one more deep, slow breath in, and as you softly let it out, let's begin this slow and soothing journey. Imagine yourself floating weightless, drifting effortlessly over a sea of soft, silver clouds. Below you, the vast landscape of Japan sleeps deeply under a quilt of velvet shadows. The air grows cooler, carrying the faint, sweet scent of blooming cherry blossoms resting for the night. Slowly, from the mist, the perfect, sweeping silhouette of the mountain begins to rise. We are softly approaching the heart of the slumbering giant, where every stone, every breeze, and every shadow holds a quiet, ancient secret waiting to be whispered to those who listen. Long ago, beneath the quiet slumber of the earth, three distinct mountains were born in total darkness. They rested quietly over countless millennia, slowly embracing one another until they became a single, seamless giant. This gentle giant is the one we see today, wrapped in its soft, snowy blanket. Deep within the bedrock, layers of ancient, cooled basalt tell a soothing story of time standing perfectly still. The mountain is not merely a single peak, but a beautifully woven tapestry of older sleeping giants named Komitake and Kofuji, softly blanketed by the youngest, majestic Fuji. They rest together in a timeless embrace, a quiet family of stone and earth dreaming under the starlit sky. Imagine the profound calmness of millions of years, folded gently together, layer by gentle layer, creating the perfect sweeping curve that graces the horizon. This ancient, slow merging is a beautiful reminder that nature takes its time, never rushing, always resting, slowly building beauty in the quietest depths of the silent, dreaming world. The sweeping, graceful slopes that cascade from the summit are known the world over for their stunning, almost perfect symmetry. This gentle, balanced shape is composed of basalt, a dark, heavy rock that flows smoothly and slowly when awakened, creating soft, long curves rather than steep, jagged edges. Now entirely cooled, this dark stone absorbs the gentle warmth of the daytime sun and softly releases it into the crisp night air, offering a quiet comfort to the sleepy forests below. The basaltic slopes form a magnificent natural cone, a shape so deeply calming to the human eye, representing perfect balance and absolute harmony. As your mind traces this long, unbroken line descending from the peak down into the shadowy valleys, you can feel a matching symmetry settling deep within your own breathing. The mountain stands perfectly still, an anchor of immense gravity and absolute peace, quietly holding the earth together while you drift further and further into a deep, uninterrupted rest, cradled by its timeless geometry. Deep within its very core, the mountain is currently enjoying a long, profound, and peaceful slumber. For hundreds of years, this beautiful giant has been quietly dreaming, resting softly after a long history of earth-shaping activity. Its quiet state is beautifully known as dormancy, a deep and restorative hibernation that brings complete stillness to the landscape. In this gentle slumber, the mountain acts as a massive, silent guardian of the night, radiating nothing but calmness and quiet stability. There is no urgency here, only the very slow, deeply patient passage of time, measured not in minutes or hours, but in the slow turning of the seasons and the quiet shifting of the distant stars. You can almost hear the slow, heavy heartbeat of the mountain in the gentle rustling of the leaves and the quiet sigh of the nocturnal wind. It is a comforting reminder that even the most powerful forces of nature need to rest, beautifully inviting you to join in its long, peaceful and unbroken sleep. Resting peacefully at the northern base of this slumbering giant lies a delicate necklace of 5 pristine lakes, beautifully curved like shimmering crescents of fallen moonlight. These quiet, glassy waters were born softly from the ancient movements of the earth, gently capturing the mountain's perfect reflection upon their still surfaces. As the deepest blues of twilight slowly descend, the lakes transform into massive dark mirrors, perfectly echoing the silver dusting of the Milky Way above. Not a single ripple disturbs this perfect illusion, blurring the soft boundary between the tranquil earth and the infinite cosmos. Imagine sitting by the grassy edge of Lake Kawaguchi, wrapped in a thick, warm blanket, watching the upside-down peak of the mountain floating seamlessly in the starry water. The cool, gentle mist rolling softly off the surface carries a deep, soothing silence, washing over your tired mind, clearing away the lingering echoes of the day, and leaving nothing but the pure, mirrored tranquility of the deeply sleeping water. When the full, luminous moon slowly rises into the crisp indigo sky, it casts a delicate silver glow directly upon the snowy summit of the quiet mountain. This beautiful, glowing phenomenon turns the icy peak into a softly shining beacon, a gentle lighthouse for those navigating the landscape of dreams. The brilliant moonlight cascades slowly down the smooth basaltic slopes, painting the ancient rock with a pale, pearlescent wash. Down below, this gentle light is caught once again by the still lakes, creating a glowing pathway of soft illumination that seems to lead straight into the heavens. There is a deep, profound softness to this lunar glow, one that asks nothing of you but simply to witness its quiet beauty. The moon and the mountain share an ancient, unspoken conversation, a beautifully silent lullaby composed of pure light and immovable stone. As this soft silver glow fills your imagination, you can feel your own thoughts becoming lighter, softer, and completely bathed in the peaceful, gentle radiance of the night. Sprawling gently at the northwestern base of the silent mountain is a vast, ancient forest, so incredibly dense and richly green that it is affectionately known as the Sea of Trees. This beautiful, quiet woodland grows softly upon a deeply uneven bed of ancient, hardened lava, covered now by centuries of soft emerald moss. Because the volcanic rock naturally absorbs sound, the interior of this forest is blessed with an extraordinary, velvet-like silence. The wind barely whispers as it moves gently through the thick canopy of cedar and pine, leaving the forest floor in a state of absolute, profound tranquility. Wandering peacefully through this soft, mossy haven in your mind, every footstep falls completely silent, absorbed immediately by the plush, earthy carpet. The air here is incredibly pure, tasting faintly of damp earth, sweet pine needles, and the very essence of quietness itself. It is a deeply protective, sheltered place, a natural sanctuary wrapping you safely in its ancient, silent, and deeply comforting green embrace. Hidden safely beneath the roots of the silent forest are magnificent, winding pathways carved entirely by ancient, softly flowing earth. These hollowed corridors, known as lava tubes, are now peaceful, subterranean sanctuaries where the temperature remains perfectly cool and completely stable all year round. Deep inside, beautiful formations of eternal ice glisten softly in the quiet darkness, undisturbed by the changing seasons of the waking world above. Some of these caverns breathe a gentle, continuous breeze, softly exhaling the cool, purified air from deep within the mountain's heart. Imagine safely stepping into one of these smooth, curved chambers, feeling the gentle, refreshing chill naturally soothing your skin. It is a place of beautiful isolation, completely shielded from the sun and the weather, existing in a state of perpetual, calm twilight. The slow, rhythmic dripping of pure, mineral-rich water echoes softly against the smooth stone walls, creating a deeply relaxing, hypnotic melody that lulls your busy mind into a state of wonderful, echoing emptiness. As you gently travel higher up the mountain's smooth slopes, the rich, dense forests softly give way to a beautiful, sparse landscape dotted with resilient alpine plants. These tiny, delicate flowers and creeping dwarf pines have adapted perfectly to the cool, quiet life at higher elevations. They do not rush to grow, but instead take their time, patiently waiting for the gentle warmth of summer to softly unfold their lovely, understated petals. Even in the crisp, cool winds of the night, they hold securely to the mountain, a beautiful symbol of quiet strength and enduring patience. Picture the tiny, soft pinks and gentle whites of these alpine blooms, resting with their petals gently closed under the starlit sky. They live a simple, deeply peaceful existence, completely synchronized with the slow, sweeping rhythms of the majestic mountain. Their quiet, unassuming beauty reminds you that there is no need to hurry, that resting softly exactly where you are is perfectly natural, deeply beautiful, and wonderfully enough. Throughout the slow turning of the year, the great, slumbering mountain gracefully changes its beautifully textured cloak. In the deepest, quietest part of winter, it wears a brilliant, unbroken blanket of pure, soft white snow, reflecting the moonlight with a crisp, clean brightness. As the gentle warmth of spring softly approaches, the snow line slowly recedes, revealing the rich, dark, reddish-brown tones of the ancient volcanic earth beneath. This extremely slow, continuous transformation is a visual lullaby, a testament to the soothing, endless cycle of nature's gentle seasons. There is a deep comfort in this predictability, a reassuring promise that no matter what happens in the waking world, the mountain will softly change its garments, resting quietly beneath the shifting sky. Imagine the soothing gradient of colors, from the deep, rich, earthy tones at the base to the soft, powdery white of the peak, blending seamlessly together like a beautifully painted watercolor fading smoothly into the deeply comforting shadows of the advancing, starry night. The beautiful, iconic snowcap that crowns the peak of the mountain is formed by incredibly gentle, high-altitude precipitation. As the moisture-rich clouds softly drift in from the vast, dark ocean, they gracefully ascend the smooth slopes of the slumbering giant. Reaching the cooler, thinner air near the summit, these soft clouds gently release their moisture as millions of tiny, perfectly unique ice crystals. This slow, continuous dusting of delicate snow creates a thick, pure white blanket that lovingly insulates the rocky peak. The snow gently absorbs any ambient sound, ensuring that the summit remains one of the quietest, most peaceful places imaginable. Picture those tiny, crystalline flakes silently falling through the deep indigo night, swirling very softly before coming to a perfect, completely silent rest upon the ancient stone. This endless quiet snowfall is nature's own beautifully soft blanket, gently covering the earth, smoothing over every rough edge, and completely tucking the giant mountain in for a long, deeply undisturbed and profoundly restful sleep. In the exceptionally quiet moments just before the world awakens, or just as it is slipping into slumber, the mountain casts an immensely long, perfectly triangular shadow upon the sea of clouds below. This beautiful, sweeping phantom is known softly as Kage Fuji, a breathtaking shadow mountain that stretches gently toward the distant horizon. It is a deeply soothing optical wonder, a quiet projection of the mountain's perfect geometry resting softly upon the vaporous mist. The shadow slowly lengthens and softly fades as the light gently shifts, moving with an almost imperceptible, beautifully deliberate slowness. To watch this dark, triangular veil gently sweeping over the fluffy, silver-lined clouds is to witness a masterpiece of quiet, majestic pacing. It beautifully teaches your mind to slow down, to watch the very gradual shifting of light and dark, recognizing that there is profound beauty in the softly fading edges of the day. Let that long, comforting shadow gently wash over your tired thoughts, smoothly dimming the lights of your busy, waking mind. Reaching gracefully toward the very edge of the Earth's atmosphere, the soaring peak of the mountain exists in a realm of wonderfully thin, incredibly pure air. At this majestic height, the heavy, humid blanket of the lowlands is entirely left behind, replaced softly by an atmosphere so crisp, cool, and clear that the stars above appear larger, brighter, and wonderfully close. This rarefied air is deeply cleansing, offering a beautifully clean slate for every slow, gentle breath you take. Imagine gently inhaling this perfectly pure, cool evening air, feeling it travel slowly through your body, effortlessly clearing away the heavy fog of exhaustion. It is an environment completely detached from the hustle and hurry below, a serene, high-altitude sanctuary where the only movement is the slow, majestic rotation of the celestial spheres. In this elevated quietness, your breath naturally matches the very slow, sweeping currents of the high atmosphere, deeply synchronizing your own relaxing rhythm with the profound, unbroken calmness of the quiet mountain peak. Often, as the soft, high-altitude winds gently glide over the peak of the slumbering mountain, they create magnificent, beautifully rounded cloud formations. These are softly called lenticular clouds, but they are lovingly known here as kasagumo, or umbrella clouds. They hover perfectly still, directly above the summit, looking exactly like a series of smooth, stacked, misty hats gently resting upon the mountain's snowy head. Despite the very fast winds flowing continuously through them, these beautiful clouds remain remarkably stationary, a stunning scientific display of fluid dynamics wrapped in total visual calmness. They softly catch the delicate fading colors of the twilight, glowing faintly with soft lavenders and pale, soothing pinks against the deepening blue sky. Picture this gentle, motionless cloud resting beautifully above the peak, a quiet, misty halo that lovingly protects the sleeping mountain from the vastness of space. It is a deeply comforting image of absolute stillness amidst continuous flow, beautifully inviting your mind to rest perfectly still while the busy world simply passes by. The pure, pristine snow that softly caps the mountain does not simply vanish when the gentle warmth of spring arrives. Instead, it slowly, meticulously melts, embarking on a beautifully quiet, decades-long journey deep within the mountain's dark, basaltic heart. The ancient porous rock acts as an immense natural filter, gently purifying the snowmelt drop by beautiful drop as it slowly descends through the silent, unseen depths. This incredibly patient process takes many long years, meaning the crystal-clear water that finally bubbles softly from the springs at the mountain's base is completely untouched by modern time. Imagine the profound slowness of this gentle descent, the quiet, rhythmic dripping in total darkness, peacefully cleansing and perfectly chilling the water. It is a beautifully hidden cycle of deeply patient renewal, moving entirely out of sight, yet continuously providing life and softness to the surrounding valleys. Let the thought of this slow, ancient, purifying journey gently wash through your own tired muscles, softly dissolving any lingering tension into pure, flowing calmness. Nestled gently in a quiet, traditional village near the foot of the mountain are 8 incredibly clear, deeply peaceful ponds known perfectly as Oshino Hakai. These beautiful, glassy pools are the final, gentle resting place of the mountain's slowly filtered snowmelt. The water here is so remarkably transparent, so flawlessly pure, that it appears wonderfully invisible, gently holding deep blue hues that seem to glow softly from the earth itself. Looking down into these quiet depths is like gazing into a beautifully serene aquatic sky, where gentle emerald aquatic plants sway softly in the extremely slow, invisible currents. The quiet surface perfectly mirrors the traditional thatched roofs and the towering, snowy peak in the distance, creating an unbroken harmony of earth and water. Picture yourself sitting softly by the wooden edge of one of these glowing blue ponds, listening to the very faint, delicate trickle of the ancient water finding its way to the surface. It is the soothing, beautiful sound of time slowing down completely. Deep beneath the remarkably calm and beautifully symmetrical slopes of the mountain lies a fascinating, incredibly powerful geological meeting place. This beautifully sleeping giant is uniquely positioned exactly where 3 massive tectonic plates gently, continuously converge deep within the Earth's quiet crust. It is this incredibly slow, ancient meeting of immense shifting continents that carefully gave birth to the mountain's towering grace. Yet despite the unimaginable planetary forces gently pressing together deep below in the total darkness, the surface remains entirely peaceful, covered in soft snow and whispering pine. It is a stunning, deeply comforting reminder that incredible strength can exist in perfect, absolute stillness. The mountain beautifully absorbs the deep, slow energy of the turning planet, wonderfully translating it into a beautifully sweeping, silent monument of total tranquility. As you rest softly in your bed, imagine that deeply grounded stability, that immense quiet strength gently supporting you from below, allowing you to completely surrender your weight to the beautifully immovable, deeply peaceful earth. Moving perfectly silently through the deeply shadowed, heavily wooded slopes of the mountain is a wonderful, elusive creature known as the Japanese sero. This beautiful, gentle animal, resembling a soft, thick-coated antelope, navigates the steep, rocky terrain with an incredibly calm, deeply deliberate grace. It moves without ever rushing, stepping softly upon the fallen pine needles, beautifully blending into the misty, tranquil environment. As the evening deepens, these quiet, solitary wanderers find a soft, protected hollow beneath the ancient drooping cedar branches, safely curling up to rest against the cool, volcanic earth. They live a life of complete, beautiful harmony with the silent mountain, totally undisturbed by the vast, noisy world far below. Picture the deep, comforting stillness of this soft, gentle creature, resting quietly in the peaceful forest night, its slow, rhythmic breathing perfectly matching the gentle, swaying motion of the dark, protective trees. It is a perfectly peaceful, undisturbed existence, gently encouraging you to find your own soft, quiet space to deeply, completely rest. For hundreds of softly passing generations, this breathtaking, slumbering mountain has been deeply revered as a wonderfully sacred place of ultimate peace and quiet contemplation. Long ago, gentle seekers of tranquility would slowly, mindfully walk its beautifully sweeping slopes, seeking the profound emptiness and deep, quiet clarity that only such a majestic height could provide. They found a deeply soothing comfort in the rhythmic, crunching sound of their very slow footsteps on the dark volcanic ash, treating the journey not as a difficult climb, but as a deeply calming, moving meditation. Every slow, intentional breath in the thin, crisp air brought them closer to total inner stillness. Even today, that beautiful, ancient energy of deep, quiet reverence lingers softly in the mist, gently infusing the landscape with an incredibly profound, timeless serenity. You do not need to walk the long, winding path to feel this peace. You need only close your eyes, breathe very softly, and allow the ancient, quiet spirit of the mountain to gently hold you. While the mountain is wonderfully famous for its beautifully perfect, sweeping symmetry, there is a large, gentle depression on its southeastern slope known softly as the Hoey crater. This beautiful, sweeping curve in the otherwise perfect cone is a quiet, lasting reminder of the mountain's deep, ancient history. Far from a blemish, this beautifully smooth, bowl-like formation adds a wonderful organic softness to the mountain's immense silhouette. It beautifully catches the deep indigo shadows of the evening, creating a profoundly soothing, beautifully textured landscape of soft, rolling curves. The crater gently breaks the sharp winds, offering a wonderfully quiet, sheltered pocket where the snow drifts perfectly smoothly, creating beautifully unbroken dunes of soft, white powder. It is a deeply beautiful reminder that true peace and profound tranquility do not require absolute perfection, but simply a gentle acceptance of the natural, softly changing shapes of our journey. Imagine safely resting in that soft, deeply shadowed, snowy bowl, completely protected, wonderfully cradled by the deeply sleeping earth. At the very highest, snow-dusted peak of the sleeping mountain, there is a beautifully deep, remarkably wide, and profoundly silent summit crater. When the very gentle, high-altitude night winds gracefully drift over the smooth, icy rim of this massive sleeping bowl, they create a beautifully soft, wonderfully low acoustic hum. It is an incredibly subtle, deeply resonant sound, exactly like blowing very gently across the smooth opening of a massive, ancient glass vessel. This completely natural, wonderfully deep frequency carries across the beautifully desolate moonlit rocks, vibrating with an incredibly calm, extremely low energy. This beautifully soft, atmospheric music is the true, gentle lullaby of the slumbering mountain, a beautifully continuous, deeply soothing breath of the deeply resting earth. Imagine this extremely low, soft humming vibration gently descending from the starry peak, traveling completely smoothly through the crisp night air, and quietly wrapping around your tired mind, gently coaxing your brainwaves to wonderfully slow down and match its incredibly peaceful, beautifully ancient rhythm. Although we are safely resting in the deep, quiet blanket of the night, there is a beautiful, peaceful secret. The mountain holds softly for the very first, gentlest light of dawn. During the incredibly crisp, quiet mornings of late summer, before the snow has beautifully returned, the rising sun gently paints the ancient, dark basalt in a magnificent, breathtaking shade of soft, glowing crimson. This quiet, fleeting phenomenon is beautifully known as Red Fuji. The deeply warming, soft red light gracefully travels slowly down the smooth, sweeping slopes, a deeply comforting, wonderfully slow wave of gentle warmth washing over the deeply sleeping stone. It is a stunning, beautifully silent awakening that holds absolutely no hurry, gently transitioning the world from deep, velvet shadows to beautifully soft, rosy light. Holding this beautifully warm, deeply gentle image in your resting mind perfectly prepares you for a deeply comforting, restorative sleep, gently knowing that exactly like the quiet mountain, you will beautifully, gently awaken to a deeply soft, warming light. Because the beautiful, sweeping peak of the slumbering mountain reaches so incredibly high into the dark, quiet sky, it exists far above the heavy, hazy dust of the lower waking world. Up here, the deep, velvet canopy of the night is absolutely breathtakingly brilliant. Countless millions of soft, silver stars gently twinkle in the completely quiet, profoundly dark indigo sky, forming a beautifully sprawling, glowing tapestry of ancient, silent light. The Milky Way gracefully arcs perfectly over the smooth, snowy summit, looking beautifully like a massive, glowing river of soft diamond dust pouring gently down the slopes. There is zero light pollution here, only the deeply pure, ancient illumination of distant, softly burning suns. Watching these incredibly slow, majestic constellations softly wheel across the beautifully vast, totally silent heavens puts everything into a wonderfully calm, deeply peaceful perspective. You are perfectly safe, beautifully tiny, completely held within the immense, deeply quiet, and beautifully dark embrace of the wonderfully sleeping universe. The majestic, beautifully slumbering mountain does not rest alone, but is completely surrounded by a deeply peaceful, wonderfully expansive, naturally protected sanctuary. This beautifully sprawling region is carefully preserved, gently ensuring that the ancient whispering forests, the perfectly still, glassy lakes, and the deep, silent valleys remain beautifully untouched by the loud, rushing modern world. It is a wonderfully vast, deeply quiet domain dedicated completely to nature's deeply slow, beautifully patient rhythms. Within this peaceful, totally protected embrace, beautifully delicate ferns gently unroll their soft green spirals exactly as they have for countless centuries, completely unbothered by time. The air remains wonderfully sweet, deeply fresh, and beautifully clean, carrying the soft, calming scent of damp earth and deeply resting pine. Knowing that this beautifully vast, incredibly silent wilderness exists out there, wonderfully protected and totally peaceful, brings a deeply soothing, beautiful comfort to your tired heart, completely assuring you that there are still deeply perfect, wonderfully quiet places where the earth completely, safely sleeps. As the deep, incredibly quiet night continues to softly mature, the very cool, wonderfully pure air resting upon the snowy summit begins a deeply slow, completely invisible, gentle journey downward. This beautiful, beautifully subtle movement of incredibly cold, dense air gracefully sinking along the smooth, sleeping slopes is perfectly known as a katabatic wind. It is an incredibly gentle, beautiful breath of the slumbering mountain, softly gliding over the ancient basalt and the deep, whispering cedar forests below. This wonderfully slow, beautiful exhalation carries the deeply crisp, perfectly pure essence of the snowy peak softly down into the valleys, beautifully cooling the sleeping earth. Imagine this incredibly soft, beautifully cool breeze gently washing over you, perfectly soothing your skin and deeply quieting your busy thoughts. It is beautifully sweeping away the heavy, lingering heat of the long day, perfectly wrapping you in a deeply fresh, wonderfully clean, and beautifully comforting layer of pure, natural, incredibly calming coolness upon the beautifully sweeping, completely silent slopes of this wonderfully ancient, deeply slumbering mountain. Time does not behave exactly as it does in the busy waking world below. Here, the minutes and hours completely, beautifully melt away, seamlessly replaced by the incredibly slow, wonderfully vast rhythms of the ancient earth and the beautifully wheeling stars. The silent mountain measures its deeply peaceful life not by ticking clocks, but by the beautifully slow, deep accumulation of soft white winter snow and the incredibly gradual, silent shifting of the deeply buried stone. To rest perfectly here is to completely step outside the rushing river of modern time, softly stepping onto the wonderfully firm, deeply quiet shores of eternity. There is absolutely no deadline, no hurry, and completely no rush. There is exactly, perfectly, only this beautiful, quiet moment, deeply resting under the softly glowing ancient silver stars, perfectly cradled by the deeply slow, wonderfully enduring, beautifully gentle heartbeat of the deeply sleeping, majestic giant. Deep beneath the beautifully smooth, softly sleeping surface of the mountain, there is an intricate, wonderfully quiet tapestry of time. Over countless thousands of softly passing years, the earth gently laid down alternating layers of deeply rich, dark stone and wonderfully soft, fine earth, beautifully creating what scientists softly call a stratovolcano. This extremely slow, incredibly patient layering is beautifully akin to folding a deeply warm, comforting blanket over and over again, gently adding profound weight and quiet stability to the sleeping giant. Each perfectly silent ancient layer represents a completely finished chapter of the Earth's deep history, peacefully resting exactly where it was beautifully placed. Imagine this deeply layered, perfectly secure foundation resting quietly beneath you, wonderfully absorbing any lingering vibrations of the waking world. It is a deeply grounding, wonderfully secure architecture of pure, ancient earth, lovingly built by the beautifully slow, endlessly patient hands of deep time, perfectly offering you a profoundly solid, perfectly peaceful place to lay your heavy, tired head upon the incredibly smooth, deeply ancient basalt rocks that rest quietly along the mountain's majestic slopes. A beautifully slow, miraculously quiet form of life gently unfolds. Tiny, perfectly delicate patches of soft, silvery green lichen cling beautifully to the dark stone, living an incredibly peaceful, deeply unhurried existence. These wonderfully resilient, softly textured little guardians do not require deep soil or heavy rains. They perfectly, quietly draw all they need from the gentle passing mist and the soft, diffused starlight. They are absolute masters of complete stillness, growing so wonderfully slowly that their gentle expansion is entirely invisible to the passing eye. Picture these beautifully soft, miniature landscapes, gently carpeting the ancient stone, adding a beautifully soft velvet texture to the quiet mountain. They beautifully teach the resting mind that true strength lies in profound softness, deeply encouraging you to simply rest exactly where you are, wonderfully absorbing the quiet, gentle nourishment of the beautifully peaceful, deep indigo night. Far below the beautifully silent, softly snow-dusted peak, there exists a wonderfully slow, perfectly hidden ocean of remarkably pure, completely undisturbed water. This deep underground aquifer is gracefully held within the porous ancient stone, a beautifully vast reservoir of pure liquid tranquility. The gently melted snow from decades past travels beautifully, remarkably slowly through the quiet darkness, gracefully moving only a few soft inches every peaceful year. This beautifully hidden, remarkably patient journey deeply purifies every single soft drop, washing away any lingering traces of the busy world above. Imagine this profoundly deep, completely silent body of pure, cool water resting peacefully beneath the majestic mountain, beautifully mirroring the vast starlit sky above. The extremely slow, remarkably gentle flow of this deeply hidden aquifer perfectly echoes the slowly calming, beautifully regular rhythm of your own deep, restful breathing, gently washing away the heavy thoughts of the day with its perfectly pure, wonderfully slow, completely unseen currents. As the deep, velvet night gently deepens around the slumbering mountain, a beautifully soft, wonderfully thick blanket of silver fog slowly begins to roll over the perfectly still surfaces of the 5 quiet lakes. This incredibly gentle, beautifully weightless mist softly obscures the edges of the dark forests, completely blurring the boundary between the quiet earth and the gently resting water. It moves with a beautifully slow, creeping grace, silently absorbing every faint, distant sound until the entire landscape is wrapped in a wonderfully thick, deeply comforting silence. Picture this perfectly soft, beautifully glowing mist, gently wrapping around the deeply sleeping landscape, turning the world into a perfectly soft, beautifully painted watercolor of deep indigos and pale, silvery grays. This gentle rolling fog beautifully invites your mind to gently let go of sharp details and clear borders, wonderfully allowing your heavy thoughts to softly dissolve into the deeply peaceful, beautifully featureless comfort of the perfectly quiet, misty night. In the deeply secluded, wonderfully quiet valleys that gently cradle the base of the majestic mountain, natural thermal springs gently bubble to the softly sleeping surface. In the crisp, beautifully cool air of the deep night, a soft, warm steam rises gracefully from these glowing, perfectly clear pools. Here, deep in the ancient, whispering woods, beautifully gentle snow monkeys, with their deeply thick, wonderfully soft fur, sit perfectly still in the warmly soothing, completely mineral-rich water. Their beautifully dark, expressive eyes softly close as they completely surrender to the profoundly comforting, beautifully relaxing warmth, gently seeping into their tired muscles. They rest in total, peaceful community, beautifully enveloped in the soft, glowing vapor under the ancient silver stars. Imagine softly sinking into that same perfectly perfect, deeply warming water, feeling every single tight muscle completely soften and gently melt away, wonderfully sharing this profound, incredibly deep, perfectly silent relaxation with the softly sleeping ancient forest, stretching beautifully across the deeply peaceful, sweeping foothills of the gently slumbering giant. Vast, wonderfully lush fields of green tea plants rest perfectly quietly under the vast night sky. These wonderfully delicate, beautifully fragrant leaves draw their incredibly rich, deeply soothing flavor directly from the ancient mineral-dense earth gifted by the resting mountain. The perfectly dark, soft earth holds the deeply gentle moisture of the passing clouds, slowly feeding the beautifully sleeping roots completely through the quiet night. As the cool, crisp mountain breeze gently brushes over the perfectly manicured, beautifully rolling green rose, it releases a wonderfully faint, perfectly sweet, deeply earthy fragrance into the deeply resting air. Picture the deeply soothing, wonderfully soft scent of these perfectly quiet tea fields, gently drifting through your open window, wonderfully calming your senses and perfectly preparing your heavy mind for a beautifully deep, wonderfully restorative, perfectly peaceful sleep, deeply rooted in the beautifully quiet, profoundly ancient, deeply nourishing earth. Gently bordering these beautifully quiet, resting tea fields are profoundly deep, wonderfully dense groves of deeply green, ancient bamboo. These perfectly tall, beautifully hollow stalks stand perfectly close together, gracefully reaching toward the soft, glowing moonlight. When the extremely gentle, beautifully slow night wind quietly passes through the grove, the smooth bamboo perfectly leans and wonderfully sways in total, absolute harmony. This incredibly gentle, beautifully synchronized movement creates a wonderfully soft, incredibly resonant, hollow, wooden clicking sound, perfectly accompanied by the deeply soothing, soft rustle of the beautifully long, delicate leaves. It is a wonderfully hypnotic, perfectly acoustic lullaby played by the gentle wind and the beautifully yielding earth. Imagine perfectly listening to this deeply rhythmic, wonderfully hollow, purely natural music, beautifully feeling the profoundly deep, wonderful flexibility of the ancient bamboo. It wonderfully reminds you to gently bend, beautifully yield, and completely let go of all deep tension, gracefully swaying softly into a profoundly deep, perfectly quiet slumber. High above the perfectly swaying bamboo, resting beautifully upon the deeply silent, majestic peak, the falling snow forms beautifully unique, perfectly delicate crystal shapes. Because the air at this profound altitude is incredibly pure and perfectly, wonderfully cool, the frozen water perfectly aligns into beautifully symmetrical, incredibly complex, softly hexagonal stars. Each perfectly tiny, beautifully microscopic masterpiece of ice gracefully falls in total, absolute silence, wonderfully adding its soft, tiny weight to the immensely deep, beautifully bright, perfectly unbroken blanket of white. Picture these incredibly intricate, beautifully soft silver stars drifting wonderfully slowly through the perfectly deep, wonderfully quiet, perfectly dark indigo sky. They are profoundly beautiful, perfectly silent messengers from the extremely high, resting atmosphere, wonderfully teaching us that even in the absolute, deep, freezing cold, nature softly creates profoundly deep, perfectly fragile, wonderfully perfect beauty. Allow these beautifully slow, totally silent, falling crystals to perfectly completely cover your heavy thoughts in a beautifully soft, perfectly quiet, wonderfully deep, deeply restful white peace. In the exceptionally quiet, beautifully still moments before the deep night fully settles, gracefully gentle alpine birds perfectly navigate the beautifully cool, incredibly thin air around the ancient summit. With their wonderfully long, beautifully dark wings gently extended, they perfectly catch the wonderfully slow, remarkably soft, invisible updrafts that rise gently from the perfectly warm valleys below. They do not flap their wings or rush, they simply beautifully perfectly glide, tracing incredibly slow, wonderfully wide, completely silent circles against the deepening twilight sky. Their profoundly peaceful, entirely effortless flight is a completely perfect display of perfectly yielding to the incredibly gentle, remarkably invisible forces of the quiet natural world. Imagine beautifully floating exactly like these quiet, profoundly gentle creatures, completely supported by the amazingly soft, extremely calm, beautifully gentle currents of the night air. Your entirely heavy body feels completely weightless, perfectly drifting in amazingly slow, purely gentle, gracefully sweeping circles toward a remarkably deep, beautifully completely uninterrupted, incredibly perfectly quiet sleep. Deeply hidden beneath the heavily forested, remarkably peaceful lower slopes, the extremely ancient, entirely quiet hollow lava tubes hold a profoundly beautiful, wonderfully secret magic. Where the incredibly thick roof of the deeply dark cave has perfectly gently collapsed, a wonderfully soft, remarkably narrow shaft of totally pure, highly brilliant starlight perfectly beautifully reaches down into the complete, perfectly calm darkness below. This incredibly gentle, beautifully soft beam of ancient, remarkably silver light wonderfully strikes the completely smooth, beautifully eternal ice formations perfectly resting on the entirely quiet cavern floor. The totally ancient ice gently catches this perfectly soft starlight, perfectly glowing with a remarkably faint, beautifully subtle, incredibly deep blue luminescence. Picture this perfectly perfect, entirely quiet, remarkably glowing sanctuary, deeply safely, completely hidden below the sleeping earth. It is an extremely calm, remarkably perfectly completely peaceful, beautifully deeply silent refuge, where only the purely softest, wonderfully gentlest light completely perfectly beautifully quietly enters. As the deep whispering cedar forests gently give way to the beautifully quiet, crisp subalpine zone, the perfectly dark, softly resting landscape beautifully shifts. Here, wonderfully slender, beautifully elegant Erman's birch trees stand perfectly still, their incredibly soft, purely papery white bark beautifully gleaming, like faint, wonderfully delicate ghosts in the beautifully soft, pure moonlight. Their totally graceful, beautifully twisting branches perfectly show the deeply slow, incredibly gentle shaping of the purely soft, high-altitude winds over countless, perfectly peaceful decades. In the beautifully deep, completely still, remarkably quiet night, these wonderfully pale, completely graceful trees look entirely like beautifully painted, deeply completely peaceful guardians softly protecting the remarkably slow, beautiful ascent to the snowy peak. Imagine perfectly walking beautifully softly through this extremely quiet, remarkably glowing white forest, feeling completely safely, completely wonderfully, completely peacefully guided by their perfectly soft, deeply, incredibly, beautifully bright, purely gentle presence as you perfectly, wonderfully, gracefully, safely, slowly drift deeper into completely perfect slumber. Farther down in the deeply sheltered, beautifully quiet ravines, wonderfully broad, remarkably soft maple leaves that gracefully fell during the quiet autumn are undergoing a perfectly slow, beautifully, incredibly gentle transformation. Resting completely peacefully on the perfectly soft, profoundly dark, remarkably damp forest floor, they are perfectly silently, deeply wonderfully returning completely, perfectly deeply, entirely to the deeply sleeping earth. This is a remarkably slow, deeply comforting, perfectly soft process of entirely pure renewal, where the wonderfully, beautifully soft, deeply resting organic matter entirely quietly, completely smoothly, perfectly turns into incredibly rich, deeply nourishing, remarkably perfectly dark soil. Picture the incredibly slow, completely profoundly peaceful, deeply gentle sinking of these wonderfully soft, perfectly delicate leaves, entirely gracefully letting go of their purely perfect, wonderfully deep structure to become perfectly beautifully one with the remarkably profound, entirely quiet mountain. It perfectly, gently, beautifully reminds you perfectly that totally safely letting go is a perfectly, deeply, deeply, completely, beautifully, beautifully natural, entirely perfectly restful act. In the quiet, fleeting moments, just as the sun dips completely below the vast, distant horizon, a beautiful, magical light softly kisses the highest snow-covered peak. This breathtaking optical phenomenon, known as the gentle alpenglow, bathes the ancient ice in a remarkably soft, delicate shade of glowing rosy pink. The deep frozen snow perfectly captures this beautiful fading sunlight, radiating a profoundly warm, comforting glow against the rapidly advancing, deeply dark purple of the approaching night sky. It is a stunning visual whisper, a beautifully soft transition that bridges the active day and the deeply restful night. Imagine this incredibly soft, beautifully warm pink light gently washing over your tired mind, melting away the sharp edges of your waking thoughts. It is nature's own beautifully painted lullaby, slowly dimming the lights of the world, wonderfully preparing the grand sleeping mountain and your peacefully resting body for a completely deep, totally undisturbed, and profoundly beautiful night of restorative sleep. Often, exactly as the heavy night air deeply settles into the vast winding valleys below, an incredible, deeply soothing atmospheric phenomenon softly occurs. A beautifully thick, remarkably gentle layer of cool air becomes perfectly trapped beneath a layer of slightly warmer air above, completely filling the lower lands with a magnificent, profoundly silent ocean of pure white mist. From the high, quiet slopes of the sleeping mountain, this beautifully unmoving, totally silent expanse looks exactly like a vast, gently rolling sea of soft, silver clouds. The towering, majestic peak beautifully pierces straight through this misty blanket, resting entirely alone as a deeply quiet, perfectly isolated island in the tranquil sky. Picture yourself sitting completely safely on this high, peaceful shore, gazing out over the completely silent, wonderfully endless expanse of softly glowing, moonlit vapor. It is a deeply separating, wonderfully protective barrier, perfectly keeping all the noise and heavy rush of the world completely submerged and beautifully, totally silenced. Because the beautifully massive, perfectly symmetrical mountain reaches so incredibly high into the dark heavens, it beautifully hosts a perfectly stacked series of deeply quiet, unique worlds. These are wonderfully gentle microclimates, perfectly stacked, completely one on top of another like beautifully quiet, deeply sleeping kingdoms. At the remarkably warm, perfectly soft base, broad leaves gently sway in the humid, heavily rich air. As you drift beautifully higher in your peaceful mind, the air becomes completely crisp and wonderfully dry, supporting beautifully deep, dark, quietly sleeping pine needles. Higher still, perfectly pure, wonderfully silent ice and perfectly bare, deeply ancient basalt completely rule the quiet, starry night. Imagine gracefully floating completely upward through these beautifully distinct, deeply peaceful layers, feeling the gentle, incredibly soothing transition of the perfectly cooling air against your relaxed skin. Each perfectly quiet, beautifully sleeping layer brings you wonderfully closer to the completely pure, totally undisturbed, perfectly beautifully, absolutely silent vacuum of the deeply profound, beautifully vast cosmos. Deep within the ancient thick forests that gracefully blanket the softly sleeping lower slopes, a beautifully powerful, entirely unseen network rests quietly in the dark. The thick, ancient roots of the towering cedar and fragrant cypress trees reach incredibly far down into the soft, nutrient-rich volcanic soil. They beautifully wrap their long, deeply patient wooden fingers securely around the heavy, sleeping stones, gently holding the vast, tranquil mountain firmly in place. It is a completely silent, deeply patient embrace, a wonderful, unseen anchoring that perfectly stabilizes the gentle earth. Picture this massive, intricate, and entirely quiet web of strong, deeply grounding roots resting safely beneath the forest floor. They represent a beautiful, profound stability and a deeply quiet resilience. Just as these ancient roots effortlessly hold the immense weight of the towering trees and sleeping earth, you too are deeply, beautifully supported. You can completely release your heavy weight, wonderfully trusting the firm, incredibly quiet embrace of the softly sleeping world. Of all the quiet, shimmering bodies of water that gently curve around the mountain's northern base, Lake Motosu is renowned for its profound, breathtaking depth. Because its peaceful waters reach so far down into the dark, cool earth, the lake wonderfully resists freezing even during the crisp, deep winter nights. Instead, it remains a perfectly smooth, completely liquid, profoundly dark mirror beneath the stars. On windless, remarkably quiet evenings, the entirely undisturbed surface of this deep, cold lake becomes exactly like beautifully polished, softly reflective dark glass. Imagine gazing softly into this incredibly vast, completely flat expanse of purely sleeping water. It entirely captures the towering, softly glowing snow-capped mountain above, reflecting its sweeping beauty so flawlessly that it becomes impossible to see where the dark earth ends and the mirrored sky begins. This wonderfully unbroken reflection creates a beautifully symmetrical world of pure, perfect silence, gently pulling your heavy, tired mind into a state of remarkably deep, completely liquid tranquility. Just a short, peaceful distance away lies the deeply calm, wonderfully intimate, and softly curving Lake Shoji. Being the beautifully smallest of the naturally formed crescent lakes, it perfectly holds a deeply cozy, incredibly protected atmosphere, completely sheltered from the sweeping winds. When the remarkable glowing arc of the Milky Way slowly rises into the pure, deep indigo sky, its countless millions of soft, ancient silver stars are caught beautifully upon Lake Shoji's completely still surface. The dark, sleeping water acts as a gentle, flawless canvas, beautifully painting the immense galaxy directly onto the quiet earth below. Picture yourself resting safely on the soft, grassy banks of this tiny, perfect lake, wonderfully surrounded by stars both impossibly high above you and beautifully glowing just inches from your feet. You are wonderfully suspended in a vast, softly glowing universe of profound, unbroken peace, where the quiet water and the ancient heavens beautifully merge into one single, gently resting dream. High upon the rocky, quietly sleeping slopes, where the majestic, ancient forest beautifully thins, tiny, intricate worlds of deeply green, incredibly soft alpine moss gently cling to the dark, cooled basalt. As the deep, beautiful night softly lowers the temperature of the crisp mountain air, perfectly pure, wonderfully gentle, tiny dewdrops slowly begin to form upon these soft, delicate emerald tendrils. Each completely round drop of remarkably cool water gently acts as a tiny, perfect, softly glowing lens. When the very faint, delicate starlight completely reaches the quiet mountain, it perfectly catches in these thousands of miniature resting water droplets, creating a beautiful, incredibly subtle, sparkling carpet across the dark stone. Imagine perfectly observing this deeply quiet, remarkably microscopic universe, wonderfully marveling at the soft, completely effortless way the sleeping earth quietly gathers the pure moisture of the night. It is a wonderfully simple, deeply perfect act of quiet, gentle nourishment, completely soothing your mind with its profound miniature beauty. There is a remarkably rare, incredibly beautiful and deeply peaceful lunar event that softly graces the majestic mountain, affectionately known to quiet observers as Pearl Fuji. During a perfectly full, wonderfully bright moon, there exists a beautifully fleeting, magically quiet moment when the glowing silver sphere aligns perfectly with the snowy, towering peak. As the softly glowing moon gently, incredibly slowly descends directly behind the quiet summit, it perfectly appears like a massive, luminous pearl softly resting within a beautiful, ancient volcanic cradle. The incredibly soft, purely white light from the moon seamlessly blends with the beautifully pure, pale snow, creating a stunning, glowing beacon in the deep indigo night. Imagine watching this incredibly slow, perfectly silent cosmic alignment, feeling the profound, beautiful harmony between the ancient sleeping earth and the gentle wandering moon. It is a deeply calming, perfectly synchronized celestial dance, gracefully slowing down your own heavy heartbeat, beautifully leading you into a state of pure resting tranquility. Though the towering, perfectly sweeping slopes are securely blanketed in pure, freezing white snow, far down within the unseen, beautifully dark core of the ancient mountain, a deeply soothing, wonderful warmth still gently exists. This remarkably slow, deeply geothermal heat is a completely safe, incredibly distant reminder of the deeply sleeping giant's ancient, completely quiet vitality. The incredibly heavy, profoundly deep layers of dark basalt and ancient ash beautifully insulate this gentle warmth, ensuring it never disturbs the completely frozen, softly sleeping surface above. Imagine this profoundly deep, completely contained, beautifully steady, soft heat resting miles beneath the peaceful earth, glowing like a perfectly banked, quietly resting ember. It is exactly like having a wonderfully heavy, deeply heated stone gently resting at the very bottom of your soft bed, radiating a completely invisible, profoundly comforting, deep safety. This gentle, beautifully buried warmth completely anchors the mountain, beautifully providing a deeply perfect, incredibly secure, totally comforting foundation for a profoundly deep sleep. When the heavily humid, incredibly quiet days of late summer softly fade into deep twilight, the sleeping mountain is often gently washed by a soft, rhythmically soothing, warm rain. As these pure, cooling drops fall gracefully from the rolling, dark silver clouds, they softly strike the ancient, heavily porous basalt along the sweeping slopes. The thirsty, deeply resting rock entirely absorbs the gentle moisture, releasing a profoundly wonderful, incredibly earthy fragrance beautifully known as petrichor. It is the deeply calming, soft scent of damp, ancient stone, quiet earth, and pure, washed air beautifully blending together in the misty night. Picture yourself securely wrapped in a wonderfully dry, deeply soft blanket, perfectly sheltered inside a quiet wooden cabin, softly listening to the endless, beautifully hypnotic patter of this gentle rain on the roof and the dark rocks outside. It is the incredibly soothing, beautifully continuous sound of the completely resting earth, beautifully softly, entirely washing itself clean. Deep inside the profoundly silent, densely moss-draped sanctuary of the vast sea of trees, ancient, gently fallen cedar logs quietly surrender to the soft forest floor. In this remarkably protected, entirely undisturbed woodland, there is absolutely no rush to change. Over deeply peaceful, wonderfully slow decades, these magnificent heavy trunks are beautifully embraced by thick, glowing emerald moss and deeply soft, tiny wandering ferns. They gently continuously soften, beautifully returning their rich, ancient nutrients directly back into the quiet, dark volcanic earth that initially gave them life. It is an incredibly peaceful, totally painless, deeply beautiful cycle of completely quiet resting and soft, totally natural renewal. Imagine the incredibly slow, remarkably gentle yielding of this deep, heavy wood, beautifully letting go of all its solid stiffness to become entirely soft, incredibly rich, profoundly dark earth. This beautifully slow, entirely gentle process wonderfully teaches your resting mind the profound, deeply calming beauty of softly releasing, totally relaxing, and quietly letting completely go. As the deep, incredibly quiet hours of the softly sleeping night peacefully progress, the ancient, massive basalt rocks of the perfectly sweeping slopes slowly begin to release the gentle warmth they collected from the daytime sun. This profoundly slow, beautifully invisible thermal release creates completely soft, beautifully subtle microcurrents of incredibly delicate, wandering air. The mountain gently, beautifully exhales this deeply comforting warmth into the crisp, cooling darkness, creating a remarkably soft, almost imperceptible atmospheric breathing. Picture the profoundly quiet, deep indigo night wrapping around the gently glowing, slowly cooling stone, forming a beautiful, deeply comforting balance of soft heat and incredibly crisp, starry cold. This completely unseen, deeply rhythmic exchange of gentle energy is perfectly relaxing, mirroring the beautiful, steady rhythm of your own deep, softly resting lungs. The softly sleeping giant gracefully regulates the quiet, peaceful night, completely ensuring that your surrounding sanctuary remains beautifully balanced, incredibly calm, and profoundly ready for a deeply restorative, entirely unbroken slumber. In the profoundly deep, beautifully untouched hour, just before the very first delicate hint of morning light, the entire majestic mountain enters a remarkably pure state of absolute flawless stillness. The gentle katabatic winds completely cease their soft descent. The quiet forest animals sleep most deeply, and even the tiny, beautifully resting alpine flowers seem to hold their breath in the freezing, completely clear air. This is the deepest, most profoundly quiet part of the velvet night, a beautifully suspended moment where all of sweeping time feels completely, perfectly frozen in ancient ice. Imagine perfectly resting your tired awareness exactly inside this completely vast, deeply pure, beautifully empty bubble of absolute, totally unbroken silence. There is absolutely nothing beautifully moving, remarkably nothing purely shining, and absolutely completely nothing perfectly, softly making a single, incredibly tiny sound. It is a wonderfully profound, completely absolute, deeply incredibly peaceful, perfectly heavy, entirely empty, beautifully quiet void, completely perfectly welcoming your heavy, deeply sleeping consciousness. As the deepest part of the night firmly establishes its quiet reign, the expansive, mirrored surfaces of the 5 crescent lakes undergo a remarkably subtle, deeply peaceful transformation. The crisp, high-altitude air softly brushes over the incredibly still water, gently coaxing a wonderfully delicate, rolling mist to rise perfectly from the glassy depths. This soft, vaporous breath is entirely silent, curling gracefully upward in beautifully slow, mesmerizing spirals that dissolve seamlessly into the deep indigo shadows. It is a profoundly soothing visual rhythm, exactly like watching the gentle rhythmic rising and softly resting fall of a peacefully sleeping chest. Imagine perfectly resting on the soft, mossy banks, completely wrapped in a deeply heavy, beautifully warm quilt, watching this incredibly quiet, misty exhalation. The lakes are beautifully breathing out the collected warmth of the distant day, perfectly letting go of all held energy, deeply encouraging your own tired mind to softly, beautifully exhale and surrender entirely to the deeply comforting, perfectly quiet, remarkably soft, resting night. Deeply nestled within the softly shadowed, perfectly quiet lower forests, a wonderfully gentle, deeply intuitive creature moves with absolute breathtaking silence. The beautiful rust-colored Japanese red fox steps incredibly lightly upon the deeply soft, damp pine needles, its beautifully thick, perfectly soft tail gently sweeping the crisp night air behind it. It navigates the deeply sleeping woodland without disturbing a single resting leaf, perfectly completely blending into the beautiful, deep, warm shadows of the ancient cedar roots. When it finally pauses to rest, it gracefully curls into a beautifully perfect, perfectly round, soft little sphere, gently wrapping its wonderfully thick, incredibly warm tail completely over its quiet, resting nose. Picture this deeply peaceful, beautifully soft creature, sleeping so profoundly quietly beneath the immense, ancient canopy. It is a perfectly beautiful, deeply comforting image of absolute soft security, gently reminding you that the beautifully dark, resting forest perfectly, completely, deeply embraces all its perfectly quiet, softly sleeping, wonderfully gentle inhabitants in perfect peace. Buried perfectly safely beneath the deeply soft, heavily moss-draped forest floor, there rest wonderfully smooth, beautifully ancient fragments of naturally cooled volcanic glass, softly known as obsidian. These perfectly dark, incredibly smooth stones were beautifully forged in the deep, completely forgotten, roaring fires of the sleeping giant's ancient past, but now they rest in absolute, totally unbroken, profoundly cold silence. The extremely rapid, beautiful cooling process perfectly froze them into incredibly smooth, perfectly solid drops of pure, deeply dark night. If you were to gently hold one of these beautifully smooth, perfectly heavy stones in your resting hand, you would feel its deeply comforting, wonderfully cool, profoundly dense weight, perfectly anchoring your weary body. Imagine the deeply beautiful, totally smooth surface of this ancient, softly sleeping glass, completely flawlessly absorbing all the gentle moonlight and perfectly trapping exactly zero light. It is a perfectly beautiful, deeply calming physical reminder of completely absolute, deeply perfectly restful, wonderfully profound, totally quiet stillness. When the incredibly high, completely invisible night winds, gracefully sweep past the towering, purely snow-dusted summit. They often carry wonderfully soft, perfectly delicate wisps of beautifully wandering cirrus clouds. These incredibly high-altitude, remarkably thin ribbons of pure, frozen moisture gracefully paint the deeply dark, profoundly peaceful, perfectly starry indigo sky with wonderfully slow, incredibly long, perfectly sweeping strokes of pale silver. They do not perfectly obscure the brilliant ancient stars, but merely beautifully soften their deep, distant twinkling, creating a wonderfully gentle, purely mesmerizing cosmic veil. Picture these incredibly slow, beautifully stretching clouds, softly drifting exactly across the beautifully quiet, profoundly dark heavens, moving with a remarkably majestic, entirely unhurried, perfectly graceful fluidity. Watching their incredibly slow, beautifully silent, perfectly seamless drift completely mesmerizes the busy mind, gently, perfectly coaxing your heavy, tired thoughts to beautifully untangle, wonderfully stretch completely out, and perfectly, completely dissolve entirely into the perfectly vast, wonderfully deep, deeply restful, incredibly peaceful, beautifully quiet, starry night. Deep within the incredibly vast, wonderfully sweeping ravines that perfectly cascade down the majestic mountains' softly sleeping sides, sound behaves in a deeply magical, wonderfully, profoundly soothing manner. Because the deeply dark, completely porous volcanic earth and the incredibly thick resting cedar forests gently absorb nearly all sharp noise, the only sounds that perfectly survive are beautifully low, wonderfully resonant, deeply soft, echoing whispers. A gentle, perfectly slow gust of completely soft wind rustling through the incredibly distant pine branches creates a beautifully rolling, deeply acoustic, wonderfully soft sigh that gently travels for incredibly peaceful, perfectly, completely, totally unbroken miles. Imagine perfectly listening to this amazingly soft, beautifully distant, incredibly sweeping breath of the softly sleeping mountain as it perfectly gently washes down the completely quiet valley. It is a wonderfully hypnotic, perfectly entirely natural lullaby, beautifully softening every sharp edge of the waking world, gently washing, completely, beautifully, perfectly over you exactly like a deeply soft, wonderfully slow, completely peaceful ocean wave near the beautifully sweeping, perfectly desolate, incredibly quiet upper slopes of the softly sleeping giant. Tiny, entirely invisible fissures in the deeply ancient rock gently release remarkably soft, perfectly delicate breaths of remarkably warm, deeply comforting vapor. These entirely harmless, wonderfully quiet little fumaroles are the most incredibly gentle, beautifully subtle reminders of the deeply profound, immensely slow, wonderfully deeply buried warmth perfectly resting miles below. In the remarkably crisp, profoundly cold, deeply clear night air, this completely soft, entirely gentle steam gracefully curls beautifully upward, instantly completely freezing into amazingly delicate, perfectly beautiful, deeply temporary miniature crystals before flawlessly vanishing completely into the incredibly quiet dark. Picture this amazingly soft, deeply beautifully rhythmic, entirely gentle exhalation of the beautifully resting earth. It completely perfectly mirrors a beautifully deep, wonderfully long, profoundly deeply perfectly, incredibly, entirely soft sigh of complete relief, gracefully inviting you to perfectly let go of all deep hidden tension and completely join the perfectly soft, entirely quiet, beautifully deeply, deeply incredibly resting earth. As the remarkably deep, beautifully quiet night slowly stretches onward, the immense, perfectly unbroken silhouette of the grand mountain acts as a wonderfully massive, deeply silent cosmic sundial. Against the profoundly dark, incredibly vast, perfectly starry backdrop, the sharp, beautiful outline of the sleeping giant remains entirely still, while the entire glowing universe beautifully, slowly, majestically rotates directly behind it. Watching the remarkably soft, deeply ancient silver stars gracefully slip silently behind the purely dark, immovable basalt edge is incredibly mesmerizing. It beautifully highlights the amazingly profound, wonderfully slow passage of deep celestial time. Imagine your heavily resting mind gently following exactly those beautifully slow, incredibly quiet, softly glowing stars as they gracefully, perfectly, completely safely disappear entirely behind the perfectly silent, beautifully protective, incredibly ancient mountain. This deeply slow, profoundly quiet, beautifully endless cosmic rotation gently rocks your entirely tired, remarkably heavy consciousness into a perfectly deep, incredibly soft, entirely pure, beautifully uninterrupted, deeply comforting slumber. Beneath the incredibly dense, profoundly silent canopy of the vast sea of trees, the incredibly ancient, beautifully twisted roots of the towering evergreen sentinels form a completely seamless, perfectly interconnected underground web. These beautifully strong, wonderfully patient wooden anchors do not simply reach straight down. They gracefully weave completely perfectly together, perfectly sharing vital, deeply rich nutrients and beautifully sweet, ancient water across the entire, deeply resting forest. It is a completely silent, wonderfully beautiful, entirely hidden network of profound, deeply mutual, remarkably perfect support. Picture this incredibly vast, totally unseen, wonderfully warm community of deeply resting trees, perfectly holding exactly one another up entirely through the deeply cold, completely quiet night. It is a wonderfully comforting, profoundly beautiful reminder that perfectly, absolutely everything is deeply, safely, beautifully connected. You are completely held, deeply, safely supported, and wonderfully, warmly, entirely, perfectly, entirely, beautifully, completely anchored within the wonderfully vast, incredibly gentle, deeply, beautifully, profoundly, incredibly softly resting, perfectly quiet natural world. Just below the perfectly pure, brilliantly white, softly frozen snowline, there exists a wonderfully quiet, deeply crisp zone where the incredibly clean scent of the high-altitude air is remarkably soothing. Here, beautifully sparse, incredibly resilient dwarf pines gracefully release remarkably subtle, incredibly faint hints of wonderfully sweet, deeply fresh resin into the cooling, remarkably quiet night breeze. This incredibly pure, completely clean, wonderfully crisp aroma beautifully clears the tired mind, gently washing away the heavy, complicated, stagnant thoughts of the deeply exhausting, long waking day. Imagine taking a wonderfully slow, perfectly deep, purely beautiful breath of this profoundly clean, remarkably fresh, softly pine-scented mountain air. It completely and beautifully fills your deeply resting lungs, offering a remarkably profound, totally refreshing, incredibly pure sense of deep, absolute clarity. This wonderfully crisp, beautifully silent, totally pure fragrance perfectly, seamlessly guides your heavy, gently resting thoughts into a state of remarkably deep, entirely pristine, wonderfully pure, incredibly soft, deeply comforting rest. The incredibly dark, wonderfully rich volcanic ash that beautifully coats the gently resting, upper sweeping slopes of the majestic mountain behaves exactly like an incredibly soft, perfectly heavy, deeply natural blanket. This wonderfully fine, remarkably soft, ancient pulverized stone beautifully absorbs every single tiny, distant sound, creating an immensely profound, wonderfully absolute silence that completely defines the high alpine night. When the entirely gentle, beautifully soft mountain wind gracefully brushes directly over this purely dark, incredibly fine earth, it makes absolutely no sound whatsoever, leaving the completely peaceful night entirely undisturbed. Picture yourself gently resting upon this deeply soft, incredibly yielding, profoundly quiet volcanic sand, completely perfectly feeling it wonderfully contour to your completely heavy, incredibly deeply tired body. It is remarkably soft, deeply comforting, entirely grounded, and beautifully quiet. This completely sound-absorbing, wonderfully soft, deeply ancient earth perfectly cradles you, entirely gracefully holding you completely safe, perfectly beautifully, incredibly wonderfully deep inside the perfectly quiet, completely beautiful, remarkably restful mountain night. Scattered beautifully along the perfectly dry, completely quiet riverbeds near the mountain's deeply forested base are remarkably smooth, perfectly round, profoundly heavy stones of pure, dark basalt. These incredibly shaped, wonderfully smooth rocks were gracefully tumbled into perfect spheres by ancient, purely flowing snowmelt over countless thousands of completely peaceful, profoundly quiet years. The remarkably slow, entirely beautiful action of the cold, rushing water perfectly erased every single sharp edge, leaving behind beautifully heavy, wonderfully smooth tokens of deep, natural patience. Imagine gently rolling one of these completely smooth, perfectly cold, deeply heavy stones in the softly resting palm of your quiet hand. You can perfectly feel the immense, beautiful accumulation of deep, softly resting time perfectly contained within its flawlessly curved, remarkably dense surface. This entirely smooth, beautifully heavy, wonderfully perfect shape beautifully reminds your resting mind that incredibly slow, entirely gentle, totally persistent, soft forces can beautifully, perfectly smooth away exactly all of the deeply heavy, remarkably rough edges of the completely resting day. High in the beautifully crisp, wonderfully sparse subalpine zone, a completely quiet, remarkably gentle bird, known softly as the spotted nutcracker, rests perfectly peacefully inside the deeply dark, incredibly thick branches of an ancient sleeping pine. During the busy, brightly lit day, this beautifully speckled, incredibly intelligent creature carefully gathers incredibly nourishing, deeply rich pine nuts, safely storing them in the soft, dark earth for the approaching winter. But now, under the vast, deeply indigo, wonderfully starry night, all of that careful, gentle preparation is completely finished. The beautiful bird tucks its entirely soft, wonderfully resting beak, entirely, completely, perfectly, seamlessly under its beautifully thick, remarkably warm, perfectly gentle wing, perfectly surrendering completely to a remarkably deep, entirely uninterrupted, wonderfully safe slumber. Picture this perfectly small, incredibly soft, beautifully entirely warm, deeply resting life completely safely, totally perfectly hidden within the entirely quiet, beautifully fragrant, profoundly dark, incredibly protective evergreen needles, resting completely, perfectly safely, perfectly, wonderfully deeply within the softly sleeping mountain. As the deeply luminous, beautifully glowing silver moon gently traces its incredibly slow, completely majestic arc across the pure, entirely starry indigo sky, the profound, deep shadows cast by the sleeping mountain gracefully, remarkably slowly shift and completely beautifully stretch. This perfectly silent, entirely mesmerizing movement of beautiful deep darkness sliding perfectly smoothly over the resting valleys is like the incredibly slow, wonderfully quiet turning of an ancient cosmic clock. The soft, perfectly velvet shadows gently creep over the perfectly still, beautifully glowing lakes and the heavily sleeping, profoundly dark forests, continuously wrapping the deeply restful landscape in entirely new, wonderfully comforting layers of perfect, quiet night. Imagine lying perfectly still, completely warmly wrapped, wonderfully watching this incredibly slow, beautifully entirely quiet, profoundly deep, totally graceful ballet of deeply soft, purely silver light and perfectly heavy, deeply resting, completely absolute shadow. It completely entirely, perfectly wonderfully gently, entirely peacefully, completely soothes the deeply incredibly heavily resting, completely wonderfully tired, beautifully resting, completely perfectly sleeping, entirely perfect mind. Far above, precisely where the remarkably pure, wonderfully white snowpack softly meets the ancient dark basalt, a beautifully quiet, invisible journey begins. The very deepest layers of the heavy snow slowly, silently melt into an incredibly cold, beautifully flawless liquid. This pristine water gently, perfectly quietly seeps into the remarkably porous, deeply ancient volcanic stone, leaving all the bright, waking world entirely behind. It begins a wonderfully slow, perfectly dark descent, gracefully sinking through thousands of feet of deeply sleeping rock. The ancient mountain perfectly filters every single drop, entirely removing all impurities, creating a wonderfully perfect, deeply refreshing purity that is entirely undisturbed by the passage of time. Imagine being beautifully, totally surrounded by that perfectly dark, incredibly quiet, completely pure, deep stone. You're exactly like that perfectly clear, slowly drifting drop of snowmelt, quietly descending completely, perfectly safely into a deeply protected, wonderfully silent, completely pure, profoundly deep, beautifully entire, and totally perfect, restful darkness. To deeply rest within the wonderfully vast, incredibly quiet shadow of this majestic giant is to perfectly synchronize your own tired rhythms with the profoundly slow heartbeat of the softly resting earth. The mountain does not hurry, it does not rush. It completely ignores the frantic, buzzing pace of the busy waking world far below. It simply rests, flawlessly anchored in deep time, beautifully gathering the gentle starlight and softly holding the profound silence of the vast cosmos. When you close your heavy eyes and gently imagine this towering, peaceful presence, you can feel that same incredibly slow, deeply grounded stability taking root perfectly within your own deeply relaxing chest. Every single breath you take beautifully mirrors the slow, deeply sweeping winds, moving gently across the snowy peak. You are completely wonderfully sharing exactly this profoundly ancient, wonderfully steady, completely unbroken, purely deeply restful peace, safely deeply, entirely deeply, perfectly, beautifully fully, completely gracefully deeply, entirely fully, perfectly resting. Not far from the beautifully quiet base of the slumbering mountain, the ancient snowmelt finally returns to the surface at the breathtakingly gentle Shirito Falls. Rather than a loud, crashing river, the remarkably clear water gracefully seeps directly out from a wide, beautifully curved wall of porous basalt. It falls in countless delicate white threads, perfectly resembling a wide, gently glowing curtain of pure, soft silk. The sound it creates is an incredibly soft, deeply hypnotic, wonderfully continuous rushing, exactly like the soothing hum of a steady, perfectly gentle rain. Picture yourself resting safely nearby, feeling the incredibly fine, remarkably cool mist, softly brushing against your relaxed skin. This profoundly continuous, beautifully soft water delicately washes away the last remaining traces of your waking thoughts. It is a wonderfully pure, incredibly flawless display of nature's endless, quiet grace, perfectly coaxing your heavy mind to completely dissolve into the deeply soothing, gently flowing, remarkably calm rhythm of the peaceful night. In the wonderfully sparse, beautifully quiet, rocky clearings just below the towering summit, tiny, resilient alpine wildflowers gently prepare for the deep, silent night. As the fading warmth of the distant sun finally slips entirely below the far horizon, these incredibly delicate, soft little blossoms do something entirely magical. They wonderfully, gracefully fold their beautifully tiny petals completely inward, wrapping themselves tightly to safely conserve their gentle warmth against the remarkably crisp, profoundly cold mountain air. They do not fight the arriving darkness. They completely embrace it, perfectly understanding that the deep, quiet night is a beautifully necessary time for profound rest. Imagine these thousands of tiny, perfectly closed blossoms resting softly against the ancient dark stone, sleeping deeply under the brilliant silver stars. They perfectly teach us that it is wonderfully natural and completely safe to gently close ourselves off from the busy world, to beautifully fold inward, and to gracefully, totally, perfectly surrender to absolute, incredibly deep, entirely peaceful slumber. The incredibly profound visual majesty of the slumbering mountain is largely born from its beautifully balanced, wonderfully sweeping, classic conical shape. This gentle, perfectly flawless geometry is remarkably deeply soothing to the heavily tired human mind, beautifully symbolizing absolute stability, perfect harmony, and completely immovable rest. As your quiet, relaxed gaze naturally follows the incredibly long, wonderfully smooth line from the beautifully pure, snowy peak down into the deep, dark valleys, your own thoughts perfectly naturally align with its gentle, unbroken perfection. There are no harsh, jagged edges here, absolutely no sudden drops or deeply alarming, perfectly sharp interruptions. There is only a wonderfully continuous, remarkably soft, incredibly graceful descent into the perfectly quiet, deep earth. Picture this flawlessly smooth, wonderfully balanced sweeping curve gently anchoring the vast starry night. It beautifully invites you to gracefully smooth out the tangled, complicated shapes of your own deeply heavy, remarkably tired mind, softly guiding you toward perfectly deep, completely unbroken, entirely beautiful sleep. At the absolute, remarkably quiet zenith of the slumbering giant, the deeply massive, perfectly wide summit crater rests like an enormous, profoundly silent stone bowl softly held up to the vast cosmos. When the incredibly pure, remarkably thin, deeply freezing high-altitude winds gracefully glide directly across the beautifully smooth, completely icy rim, they produce an incredibly faint, wonderful acoustic resonance. It is a profoundly deep, incredibly soft, beautifully low-frequency hum that is felt just as much as it is heard. This remarkably continuous, incredibly subtle vibration is the entirely authentic, perfectly natural voice of the deeply resting earth, softly singing an ancient, wordless lullaby, directly into the completely empty, beautifully vast, dark, indigo sky. Imagine resting perfectly safely within this massive, wonderfully protective stone cradle, feeling that remarkably low, beautifully soft, entirely gentle vibration, softly passing completely through you. It flawlessly coaxes your deeply tired brainwaves to perfectly slow down, seamlessly matching the beautifully calm, profoundly, incredibly deep, amazingly resting ancient tone. Halfway up the wonderfully sweeping, profoundly quiet slopes of the majestic mountain lies a remarkably peaceful, incredibly beautiful resting place, gently known as the fifth station. Here, you exist in a wonderfully magical, beautifully suspended space, hovering perfectly between the deeply dense, whispering ancient cedar forests far below and the completely bare, incredibly silent, purely white snowy peak resting majestically above. In this beautifully tranquil, entirely transitional zone, the heavy, deeply humid air of the softly sleeping valleys gracefully gives way to the remarkably crisp, profoundly fresh, wonderfully dry breath of the incredibly high altitude. The deep night here is utterly flawless, incredibly still, and perfectly pure. Picture yourself completely safely pausing in this remarkably balanced, beautifully quiet midway sanctuary. Entirely wrapped in a wonderfully warm, incredibly heavy cloak, wonderfully looking out over the perfectly vast, gently rolling sea of soft silver clouds. You are beautifully, perfectly resting, completely safely exactly where you belong, perfectly held in the quiet, comforting dark, in the beautifully quiet, softly sleeping traditional wooden homes that perfectly circle the base of the slumbering mountain. A wonderfully comforting, peaceful nightly ritual quietly unfolds. A remarkably heavy, dark cast iron kettle is gently placed over beautifully warm, softly glowing embers. The incredibly pure, cold mountain spring water very slowly begins to warm, gracefully releasing a perfectly soft, deeply rhythmic, incredibly soothing hissing sound into the remarkably silent, profoundly dark room. This deeply gentle, entirely mesmerizing acoustic melody beautifully blends with the incredibly crisp, remarkably fresh scent of softly dried, deep green tea leaves resting in the smooth ceramic cup. Imagine holding that warm, beautifully textured, perfectly round cup in both of your softly resting hands, feeling the profound, radiating, incredibly gentle warmth perfectly, gracefully, and deeply seeping completely into your tired, heavy body, beautifully and safely grounding you completely for the remarkably deep, entirely perfectly, softly quiet resting night. Deep within the ancient volcanic depths of the heavily forested foothills, magnificent subterranean sanctuaries quietly exist in absolute flawless darkness. In these profoundly hidden, naturally formed basalt caves, the temperature remains remarkably constant, hovering just below the delicate freezing point throughout the entire turning year. Because the air here is incredibly still and entirely protected from the warm summer winds, the pure water slowly dripping from the ceiling creates stunning, entirely eternal pillars of remarkably clear ice. These beautifully smooth, quietly glowing frozen stalagmites look like a deeply quiet, perfectly still crystal forest resting safely within the ancient heart of the slumbering mountain. Imagine safely resting deep within this completely silent, entirely frozen sanctuary, where time itself feels entirely suspended in the remarkably clear, deeply cold ice. The profoundly beautiful, absolute stillness of this deeply hidden frozen world gently cools your busy thoughts, wonderfully slowing down your racing mind until it perfectly mirrors the deep, unbroken quiet of the ancient ice. During the beautifully short, fleeting weeks of late summer, the sweeping, dark slopes of the majestic mountain briefly host a quiet procession of respectful, deeply tired climbers seeking the dawn. But when the profound, incredibly deep, beautiful winter gently reclaims the snowy summit, every single trace of that distant human activity completely, flawlessly vanishes. The remarkably thick, perfectly pure white snow effortlessly covers the ancient winding paths, beautifully returning the slumbering giant to a state of absolute, totally unbroken isolation. The incredibly quiet, beautifully sweeping silence perfectly reasserts its profound dominance over the towering rock. Picture this massive, untouched expanse of pure, completely flawless snow, totally empty of any footprints or paths. It perfectly reminds you that no matter how incredibly busy or heavily complicated the day was, the profoundly quiet, beautiful night always gently arrives to completely smooth away every single busy mark. You are beautifully left with a remarkably pure, completely untouched, perfectly clean slate of deeply soft, remarkably silent, wonderfully perfect rest. As the heavy, quiet hours of the perfectly dark night slowly march onward, the ancient, towering cedar trees that firmly blanket the mountain's lower slopes begin a remarkably subtle, deeply hypnotic dance, driven by the incredibly soft, entirely gentle, profoundly slow descent of the cool mountain air. These massive, heavily wooden sentinels gently sway in incredibly perfect, totally seamless unison. Because their ancient branches are wonderfully thick and heavily laden with softly resting, deep green needles, they do not fiercely snap or wildly bend. Instead, they gracefully, remarkably slowly lean back and forth with a profoundly heavy, beautifully deliberate, perfectly sweeping motion. Imagine perfectly watching this incredibly vast, beautifully dark, slowly rolling wooden sea beneath the incredibly bright, ancient silver stars. The wonderfully slow, deeply rhythmic, totally hypnotic swaying motion perfectly mirrors the remarkably deep, incredibly slow, beautifully regular rhythm of a perfectly sleeping body. It wonderfully coaxing your own heavy, tired limbs to completely surrender to that same remarkably gentle, profoundly beautiful, naturally swaying rest. Even though the long, perfectly quiet night will eventually end, the magnificent mountain holds onto the deep, remarkably silent darkness for as wonderfully long as completely possible. Because of its incredible sweeping mass and perfectly towering height, it casts a wonderfully long, deeply dark, profoundly protective shadow over the western valleys, beautifully delaying the busy arrival of the waking day. Within this perfectly deep, beautifully cool, entirely lingering shadow, the ancient, softly sleeping earth is granted a few remarkably precious, incredibly beautiful, deeply extra hours of totally unbroken, perfectly silent slumber. Imagine resting safely within that completely soft, wonderfully extended, deeply dark, perfectly protective mountain shadow. There is absolutely zero rush for you to open your heavy, wonderfully resting eyes, and entirely no need to hurry back into the bright, incredibly loud, busy waking world. You are safely, completely, beautifully, entirely, wonderfully, flawlessly, perfectly, safely, deeply, completely, deeply hidden inside the deeply peaceful, wonderfully slow, remarkably dark, perfectly quiet, ancient resting mountain night. High upon the wonderfully sweeping slopes of the quietly slumbering giant, there exists a beautifully delicate, remarkably sparse type of vegetation known as alpine lichen. These perfectly tiny, incredibly resilient organisms grow with an astonishing slowness, taking entirely peaceful centuries to expand just a few incredibly soft, delicate inches across the dark basalt. They live an entirely unhurried, perfectly quiet existence, wonderfully thriving on nothing more than the crisp, cold mist and the pure, softly glowing starlight. Imagine the profound, beautiful patience of these tiny, soft lives, gently painting the ancient stones in wonderfully muted, deeply soothing shades of pale silver and remarkably soft, dusty green. They are beautifully content to simply exist in the deeply quiet, perfectly still mountain air, perfectly untouched by the fast, rushing pace of the waking world below. Their amazingly slow, completely peaceful growth beautifully encourages your heavy, racing mind to completely slow down, perfectly mirroring their profoundly patient, incredibly quiet, entirely restful alpine existence. Deeply hidden far beneath the gently rolling, beautifully quiet tea fields that safely border the sleeping mountain, there flows an incredibly slow, perfectly silent river of ancient snowmelt. This remarkably pure, completely invisible current moves through the porous volcanic earth with an incredibly gentle, completely unhurried rhythm. It takes decades, sometimes perfectly peaceful centuries, for a single soft drop to wonderfully gently travel from the snowy, glowing peak to the deep, safely resting aquifers below. Picture this perfectly dark, completely silent, beautifully flowing water, remarkably slowly moving deep beneath you, completely unseen but wonderfully present. It beautifully carries the remarkably cold, perfectly pure essence of the snowy summit, deeply cleansing the resting earth and wonderfully nourishing the deeply sleeping roots. This profoundly slow, deeply unseen river perfectly washes away the exhausted thoughts of the long day, leaving your mind wonderfully clear, incredibly quiet, entirely safe, and profoundly ready to gracefully completely rest. As the deeply dark, beautifully velvet night gently settles entirely over the majestic mountain, a remarkably subtle, profoundly quiet change softly occurs in the incredibly crisp, high-altitude air. The atmospheric pressure gracefully, beautifully softly stabilizes, creating an exceptionally calm, wonderfully still environment entirely free from harsh winds or sudden alarming shifts. This remarkably beautiful, deeply atmospheric tranquility acts exactly like a perfectly soft, entirely invisible, wonderfully heavy blanket, gently pressing down on the peacefully sleeping landscape. Imagine this perfectly gentle, beautifully unseen weight softly wrapping entirely around your heavily tired, remarkably resting body. It perfectly provides a profoundly comforting, wonderfully safe, incredibly grounded sensation, beautifully coaxing your tense muscles to completely safely, gracefully let go. You are entirely perfectly, seamlessly, profoundly peacefully, safely perfectly resting under the incredibly soft, deeply dark, wonderfully peaceful, entirely beautiful, remarkably protective quiet mountain night. In the deeply quiet, beautifully sweeping lower valleys, wonderfully small, perfectly delicate, incredibly pale night-blooming flowers begin to softly, remarkably slowly open their soft petals to the deeply dark, beautifully pure indigo sky. These incredibly shy, wonderfully gentle blossoms wait entirely patiently for the loud sun to completely disappear below the far horizon before beautifully releasing their remarkably soft, deeply soothing, perfectly sweet fragrance into the crisp, wonderfully cooling night breeze. This perfectly delicate, entirely soft perfume wonderfully drifts through the remarkably quiet air, beautifully mixing with the deep, earthy scent of softly sleeping pine and ancient, remarkably cool basalt. Picture this remarkably gentle, beautifully, entirely unseen cloud of pure, soft, floral fragrance, perfectly washing over your safely resting senses. It acts as an entirely natural, deeply wonderful, remarkably safe, softly gentle, completely deep sleep-inducing elixir, wonderfully calming your entirely tired mind and perfectly preparing you for a completely beautifully unbroken slumber. Near the perfectly still, beautifully glassy edge of Lake Yamanaka, tall, incredibly slender reeds gracefully stand in the shallow, wonderfully cold, deeply sleeping water. When the remarkably gentle, beautifully soft mountain breeze slowly and perfectly quietly sweeps directly across the deep, dark lake, these wonderfully slender reeds softly bend and beautifully sway in total, absolute unison. They wonderfully create an incredibly soft, deeply rhythmic, perfectly mesmerizing rustling sound that perfectly echoes across the completely silent water. This beautifully, entirely natural, profoundly acoustic melody is remarkably similar to the perfectly soothing, wonderfully deep, entirely continuous sound of a perfectly calm, gently rolling ocean softly brushing against a deeply quiet, perfectly sandy shore. Imagine perfectly safely resting near this entirely peaceful, beautifully dark lake, completely wrapped in a wonderfully warm blanket, flawlessly and entirely seamlessly safely listening to this incredibly soft, perfectly repetitive, remarkably entirely restful ancient water lullaby. Far above the peacefully resting lakes, soaring gracefully in the deep, starry sky, remarkably beautiful, incredibly quiet owls navigate the deeply dark pine forests. Their wonderfully wide, perfectly soft wings are beautifully evolved to make absolutely no sound at all as they gently drift through the incredibly crisp, cool mountain night. They are the deeply silent, wonderfully watchful guardians of the softly sleeping woodland, moving exactly like gentle, beautiful phantoms against the purely glowing, completely perfect silver moonlight. Picture this wonderfully graceful, entirely soundless flight taking place just above your resting head. They perfectly embody the completely, absolute, wonderfully profound silence of the majestic mountain, beautifully reminding you that it is incredibly safe to completely, entirely let go of all the loud noise of the waking world, fully leaning into the deeply perfect, incredibly pure, entirely peaceful, beautifully soft, wonderfully quiet, perfectly gentle resting dark night. The beautifully dark, incredibly dense volcanic rocks, scattered quietly across the desolate upper slopes, possess a wonderfully remarkable, profoundly soothing quality. Because they were born from extremely deep, purely cooled ancient earth, they act as magnificent, completely natural thermal banks under the vast night sky. Throughout the incredibly long, brilliantly lit day, they slowly gather the beautiful, gentle warmth of the bright sun. Now, as the deep, crisp, freezing night air softly descends, these entirely peaceful stones remarkably slowly release that captured heat back into the deeply sleeping, completely quiet atmosphere. Imagine completely safely resting your tired hands against one of these beautifully smooth, wonderfully warm ancient stones. It is a profoundly grounding, incredibly comforting sensation, beautifully reminding your heavy mind that even in the deepest, completely coldest, remarkably dark hours of the long night, there is perfectly wonderful, deeply hidden warmth, wonderfully quietly, safely, peacefully, gracefully, smoothly, resting exactly securely here, as the incredibly quiet, beautifully cold hours of the long night gently unfold. The pristine snowpack resting upon the sleeping summit undergoes a deeply soothing, perfectly invisible transformation. Under the immense, beautifully silent weight of the gently falling, perfectly soft snow, the deeper layers of pure white crystals slowly compress into remarkably dense, flawlessly clear blue ice. This incredibly slow, profoundly patient metamorphosis happens entirely without a single sound, completely hidden within the beautifully heavy, deeply sleeping mountain. Picture this perfectly silent, wonderfully hidden process of entirely natural, gentle compression safely happening exactly beneath the softly glowing silver starlight. Wonderfully represents a deeply perfect, incredibly calm settling, entirely mirroring exactly how your own remarkably heavy, totally tired body is perfectly sinking, completely softly, seamlessly into your deep, wonderfully warm, safely, purely, incredibly comfortable, perfectly, entirely, seamlessly, deeply, clean, smoothly, peacefully, safely, deeply, gracefully, peacefully, soft, entirely beautiful rest. Deeply hidden within the softly whispering shadows of the vast cedar forest, the incredibly rich volcanic soil gently acts as a beautifully massive natural haven for the resting night mist. When the incredibly soft, cooling fog slowly rolls through the ancient, perfectly sleeping trees, the dark, remarkably quiet earth gracefully absorbs every single delicate, pure droplet. This remarkably slow, deeply patient, soaking perfectly locks the soothing moisture away in absolute quiet darkness. As the ancient dirt drinks the remarkably gentle silver fog, a wonderfully deep, profoundly earthy and sweet aroma beautifully rises into the crisp night air. Picture yourself completely surrounded by this beautifully grounded, remarkably safe, entirely ancient forest floor. The ground itself is taking a long, slow, perfectly restful drink, entirely nourishing its deep roots in complete silence. This profoundly soothing, naturally perfectly quiet action perfectly models exactly how your completely tired mind can gently, softly and deeply absorb pure, relaxing peace. High upon the beautifully sweeping, completely snow-capped summit, the deeply quiet atmospheric conditions create a wonderfully mesmerizing optical illusion when the silver moonlight gently filters through the freezing night mist. As the remarkably pure, softly glowing lunar rays gracefully strike the millions of perfectly tiny, peacefully suspended ice crystals, a remarkably beautiful, incredibly faint lunar halo softly appears in the deeply dark indigo sky. This wonderfully gentle, purely soft glowing ring of pale silver light perfectly encircles the glowing moon, gracefully resting exactly over the profoundly slumbering majestic peak. It looks exactly like a beautifully soft, wonderfully ethereal, perfectly cosmic crown gently placed upon the completely quiet, sleeping giant by the remarkably vast, peacefully silent universe. Imagine completely safely watching this wonderfully slow, entirely gentle, perfectly majestic glowing ring. It profoundly, beautifully, gracefully, flawlessly, perfectly quietly, smoothly cleanses your entirely heavy, beautifully tired mind, preparing you for deep, deeply peaceful, entirely safe slumber. Far below the glowing lunar halo, exactly where the beautifully ancient cedar trees gently give way to the profoundly quiet, completely sweeping subalpine grasses, a perfectly delicate, entirely silent creature beautifully navigates the gentle night. The beautiful, remarkably large silk moth, boasting incredibly wide, entirely soft, completely pale green wings, gracefully flutters through the perfectly crisp, remarkably cool mountain air. Because its beautifully vast wings are wonderfully thickly covered in an incredibly soft, deeply plush natural velvet, it makes absolutely zero sound as it wonderfully slowly dances through the deeply indigo shadows. This remarkably wonderful, perfectly soft creature is a beautifully gentle phantom of the peaceful night, gracefully seeking nothing more than a perfectly quiet place to safely rest until the incredibly distant dawn. Picture this entirely soft, profoundly delicate, wonderfully gentle flight exactly tracing slow, sweeping invisible ribbons in the entirely still air, beautifully pulling your heavy, tired eyes into a deeply calm, perfectly safe, wonderfully soft sleep. In the entirely serene, beautifully quiet, shallow waters of Lake Kawaguchi, incredibly round, remarkably smooth, deeply dark volcanic pebbles rest perfectly at the entirely peaceful, completely submerged bottom. These wonderfully small, perfectly heavy stones have been gracefully polished for countless perfectly quiet centuries by the incredibly gentle, entirely slow lapping of the remarkably clear, deeply cooling water. As the beautifully soft, pure silver starlight perfectly penetrates the completely glassy, totally undisturbed surface, it beautifully illuminates these incredibly smooth stones, making them wonderfully look exactly like an incredibly vast, completely beautifully submerged, entirely sleeping galaxy of perfectly tiny, purely dark planets. Imagine perfectly gently, completely flawlessly, floating securely, exactly above this beautifully still, totally clear, perfectly cool water, completely mesmerized by the deep, wonderful stillness of these perfectly smooth, naturally completely rested, gracefully silent stones, safely tucked completely beneath the purely resting quiet night. As the deeply quiet, remarkably peaceful hours of the perfectly dark night gracefully lengthen toward the distant, unseen morning, the ancient, towering mountain gently shapes its own beautiful, perfectly soothing microclimate. The incredibly vast, profoundly cool basalt slopes gracefully create beautifully soft, completely invisible currents of remarkably pure, wonderfully crisp air that gracefully sweep perfectly down into the completely resting, deeply quiet valleys. These wonderfully gentle, completely flawless night breezes beautifully carry the completely pristine, perfectly pure essence of the entirely frozen, beautifully ancient snowpack directly down to the peacefully sleeping forests. As this incredibly soft, remarkably chilling wind gently, perfectly rustles directly through the entirely silent, wonderfully dark pine needles, it completely refreshes the entire sleeping landscape, gracefully clearing away any remarkably heavy, perfectly lingering warmth from the distant, fully completed day. Imagine perfectly safely resting, entirely completely, within this gracefully pure, beautifully clean, flawlessly smooth, entirely softly, deeply comforting natural wind. The deep silence of the mountain's grand crater is absolute. High above the sea of clouds, this perfectly rounded stone bowl collects nothing but pure starlight and quiet snow. No wind reaches the inner floor, leaving the delicate frost patterns perfectly undisturbed throughout the long night. These intricate crystalline shapes grow slowly upon the dark basalt, forming a microscopic winter forest that sparkles under the pale moon. It is a completely isolated world, a high-altitude sanctuary where the concept of time seems to freeze completely. Imagine lying safely within this massive protective cradle of ancient Earth. The high walls shield you from all worldly concerns, perfectly enclosing you in a peaceful, profoundly calm embrace. There is nothing to do here but watch the slow rotation of the stars, perfectly aligned with your own deep, rhythmic breathing as you sink further into unbroken, incredibly restful sleep. Long ago, careful travelers would slowly ascend these sweeping slopes at night, seeking exactly the kind of profound quiet that now surrounds you. They carried small, gently glowing paper lanterns that cast a warm, wonderfully soft golden light against the dark, sleeping earth. As they walked, the soft crunching of their woven sandals upon the volcanic ash created a rhythmic, entirely hypnotic acoustic meditation. Though those ancient wanderers are long gone, the memory of their peaceful, unhurried journey remains beautifully etched into the mountain's quiet spirit. the air still holds that wonderfully patient, deeply respectful energy. Picture that small, soft sphere of warm light gently bobbing up the long, dark trail, a tiny beacon of quiet safety moving gracefully through the immense, starry night. Let that gentle golden glow perfectly illuminate the paths of your own relaxing mind, leading you softly and surely toward a deeply comforting, restful dreamscape. Near the gentle, sprawling base of the resting giant, beautifully preserved traditional thatched roof houses sit quietly under the vast night sky. These ancient roofs are incredibly thick, carefully woven from dried pampas grass that entirely absorbs the cool, drifting mist. Over many decades, a wonderfully soft, remarkably delicate layer of green moss has grown seamlessly over the steep sloping thatch, blending the human dwellings perfectly with the sleeping natural world. Inside these deeply peaceful homes, there is absolute quiet, save for the faint, incredibly soothing sound of a solitary wooden wind chime, softly shifting in the night breeze. That gentle, hollow, deeply resonant clack is the authentic sound of profound simplicity and perfect balance. Imagine resting safely beneath that thick, mossy, beautifully protective roof, completely sheltered from the cold air, wrapped entirely in heavy, warm quilts, while the soft wooden lullaby outside perfectly rocks your tired mind to sleep. High in the crisp, perfectly thin air of the subalpine zone, remarkably sturdy dwarf larches adapt beautifully to the profound, quiet cold. Unlike other evergreens, these incredibly patient trees gracefully drop their soft needles when the deep winter softly approaches. Now, in the perfectly dark night, their bare, beautifully silver branches look exactly like delicate, ancient calligraphy carefully painted against the glowing indigo sky. They do not fight the arriving cold, they wonderfully yield to it, peacefully stripping away everything unnecessary to simply rest. This is a profound, beautifully quiet lesson written perfectly into the ancient mountain's living wood. Imagine adopting this completely graceful, entirely yielding nature perfectly within your own resting mind. Gently let go of all the heavy, unnecessary thoughts of the waking day, allowing your mind to become wonderfully bare, deeply calm, and perfectly ready to absorb exactly nothing more than entirely deep, peaceful rest. The smooth, dark stones resting in the shallow riverbeds record the slow passage of deep time. These flawless, heavy basalt rocks were shaped by thousands of quiet years under cold, flowing snowmelt. If you hold one of these smooth stones in your resting hand, you feel its comforting, absolute coolness. It is heavy, solid, and still, absorbing the gentle warmth from your palm. This simple, ancient exchange of quiet energy naturally calms the racing heart. The stone has no rush, it simply rests exactly where the ancient water placed it. Picture yourself laying your tired thoughts upon these smooth, river-worn rocks, letting the cool, quiet earth carry the weight. You are completely secure, anchored by the immense gravity of the mountain, surrounded by pure water and silent stone, drifting down into a deep, heavy, unbroken, and profoundly peaceful slumber under the stars. Within the thick, shadow-filled sanctuary of the Aokigahara forest, absolute stillness reigns. The uneven, moss-draped floor is formed from cooled lava that traps and absorbs all echoes, creating a velvet hush. Even the softest footstep is swallowed whole by the thick green carpet. In this quiet isolation, ancient cedar roots twist and weave over the dark rock, forming silent, intricate wooden sculptures. Tiny drops of dew gather on the tips of emerald ferns, catching the faint starlight before falling without a single sound to the soft earth below. Imagine standing in the center of this protective ancient wood. The overwhelming quiet washes over you, acting as a thick, acoustic blanket that silences the loud, demanding world. It is a refuge of pure, ancient peace, inviting you to match its profound stillness, letting every tight muscle soften and every anxious thought dissolve completely into the deep, welcoming and quiet night. When the full silver moon reaches its highest point in the pure indigo sky, it shines directly down upon the 5 crescent lakes. Lake Psycho, the smallest and most secluded, catches this brilliant light with flawless perfection. Because it is surrounded by tall, sheltering mountains, its surface remains as flat and undisturbed as polished obsidian. The moonlight creates a long, glowing silver pathway across the dark water, leading directly toward the slumbering giant. This radiant liquid road is a beautiful illusion, a bridge of pure light connecting the resting earth to the vast cosmos. Picture yourself sitting warmly by the grassy edge, gazing out at this shimmering silver path. It offers a clear, bright, and deeply serene direction for your wandering mind, gently pulling your consciousness away from the busy shore and carrying it smoothly along the peaceful, glowing water toward a deep, incredibly restorative sleep. Far below the frosted peak, deep inside an ancient lava cave, a delicate acoustic masterpiece is performed in total darkness. The slow, patient dripping of purified mountain water falls from the cavern roof, striking the smooth, frozen ice floor below. Each drop creates a hollow musical chime that echoes softly against the curved basalt walls. The sound is perfectly regular, spaced out by the incredibly slow, steady melting of the unseen snow above. It is a pure, natural metronome, ticking away the deep, quiet hours of the mountain night. Imagine resting safely just inside the entrance of this quiet cavern, wrapped in thick furs, listening to this delicate, icy music. The hypnotic, repetitive chimes gently bypass your active mind, speaking directly to your exhausted body, offering a steady, ancient rhythm that coaxes your heart rate to slow down, matching the peaceful, dripping heartbeat of the resting earth. Above the silent, sprawling tea fields, the crisp air holds a delicate, earthy fragrance that deepens as the night grows cold. The long, manicured rows of green bushes rest quietly, drawing rich nutrients from the dark volcanic soil. This soil, gifted by the sleeping mountains centuries ago, is the secret source of the leaves' deep, soothing flavor. As the midnight dew settles upon the curved green leaves, it locks in that gentle aroma, holding it safe until the morning sun returns. Picture the immense peace of these vast sleeping fields, their perfect geometry stretching out into the dark shadows. There is an absolute sense of order, a beautiful natural organization that calms the chaotic, racing mind. Imagine breathing in that cool, fragrant air, feeling the deeply grounded, quiet energy of the ancient tea plants filling your lungs, smoothly preparing your entire being for a long, quiet, and beautiful rest. As the night deepens, a thick, silver mist often rolls down from the upper slopes, blanketing the whispering forests in a soft, vaporous hug. This mist is not cold or damp, but feels remarkably dry and weightless, a gentle exhalation of the mountain itself. It moves with a slow, creeping grace, filling the ravines and smoothing out the jagged silhouettes of the ancient pines. Soon, the entire lower landscape becomes a sea of pale, glowing clouds, isolating the towering, snowy peak in the starry sky above. Imagine floating on your back within this soft, glowing ocean of mist. It is wonderfully buoyant, entirely separating you from the hard, solid earth. You are suspended in a realm of pure, weightless peace, safely hidden from the waking world, drifting effortlessly on the gentle, slow-moving currents of the ancient, sleepy mountain fog, surrounded entirely by complete, restful silence. Near the quiet, mossy edge of Oshino-Hakai, the legendary 8 ponds, the water glows with an ethereal, deep blue hue. This pure liquid has traveled for decades through the dark, porous basalt, cleansed of all imperfections. Now, under the starlit sky, the ponds look like deep, beautiful eyes gazing up at the galaxy. Long, delicate green waterweeds sway incredibly slowly in the invisible rising currents, moving like soft hair in a gentle breeze. Small, dark fish rest motionless near the bottom, suspended in the clear, freezing water, totally surrendered to the peaceful night. Picture the immense calmness of this pristine aquatic world. There is no struggle here, no rushing current to fight. Everything simply exists in a state of suspended, pure grace. Let that absolute, liquid tranquility wash over your tired mind, gently submerging your heavy thoughts in a pool of perfect, glowing, dark blue peace. The immense, sleeping giant of a mountain knows no concept of human time. It has stood through countless quiet nights, enduring sweeping snowstorms, gentle spring rains, and the slow, endless turning of the ancient stars. Its sweeping, perfect curves offer a profound symbol of absolute endurance and deep, immovable stability. As your own night of rest deepens, you can draw upon that incredible ancient strength. You are not a fragile, rushing thing. In this quiet, peaceful moment, you share the heavy, grounded permanence of the dark basalt. The mountain perfectly holds the earth, and the earth perfectly holds you. Imagine feeling that massive, gentle, ancient presence anchoring your very soul. The world outside may spin and rush, but here, under the quiet, starry shadow of the snowy peak, there is nothing but perfect silence, absolute safety, and the beautiful, unbroken promise of deep, pure, and entirely restorative sleep. As our peaceful, meandering journey across the quiet, sweeping slopes of this magnificent, slumbering giant slowly draws to a gentle close, the vast, ancient mountain continues its perfectly silent vigil beneath the slow, wheeling silver stars. Every incredibly slow, deeply comforting breath you take is now beautifully, perfectly synchronized with the profound, entirely unhurried heartbeat of the deeply resting earth. The sweeping, flawless curves of dark, ancient basalt, the deeply whispering, beautifully moss-draped cedar forests, and the perfectly still, completely glassy waters of the deeply sleeping crescent lakes all gently combine to form a remarkably profound, beautifully unbroken tapestry of pure, nocturnal tranquility. This magnificent mountain perfectly does not demand your attention, nor does it ask for a single ounce of effort. It simply, beautifully offers its immense, deeply towering strength as a perfectly safe, profoundly heavy anchor for your wonderfully tired, entirely deeply resting mind. You have wonderfully gently wandered through the deep, remarkably quiet starlit valleys, completely softly brushed past the perfectly sleeping, delicate alpine flowers, and stood flawlessly peacefully atop the pure, perfectly white frozen snowpack, gazing deeply into the vast, beautifully cosmic dark ocean. All of these incredibly quiet, wonderfully ancient spaces perfectly, completely rest entirely safely within you now. The remarkably deep, beautifully softly rolling night mist that perfectly entirely obscures the loud, busy waking world has completely wrapped itself around your own beautifully heavy thoughts. It has wonderfully softened absolutely every sharp edge and completely seamlessly dissolved any perfectly lingering, exhausted daytime noise. The profoundly ancient, deeply, incredibly secure, beautifully slow energy of the majestically resting, sleeping giant has perfectly beautifully settled entirely into your own incredibly relaxing limbs. It leaves you feeling entirely, completely weightless, wonderfully, incredibly, entirely safe, and profoundly, perfectly, remarkably, completely peaceful. The ancient, cooled stone safely holds the deep, beautiful memory of countless millions of quiet, perfectly resting nights, and tonight it wonderfully, beautifully, gently, entirely, perfectly, totally, safely, completely holds you. As the very last traces of the waking world dissolve into the beautifully soft, indigo depths of the night, there is nothing left for you to do but completely surrender to this profound, beautiful silence. You are perfectly supported, entirely held, and deeply, wonderfully safe within the timeless embrace of this ancient, slumbering guardian. Let the rhythmic, slow-motion dance of the distant stars and the gentle, whispering breath of the high-altitude winds carry you further into the vast, warm sea of rest. There is no tomorrow to consider, no task to finish, and no hurry to find. There is only the incredibly soft, weightless present moment, perfectly cradled by the silent, majestic earth. Feel the deeply grounded, quiet strength of the mountain radiating through the space beneath you, a source of endless, immovable peace that anchors your spirit. Your body is heavy, deeply relaxed, and perfectly surrendered to the stillness. Your mind is like the perfectly calm, mirrored surface of a mountain lake, reflecting nothing but the quiet, starry void above, entirely free from even the smallest ripple of thought. Take one final, long, deep, and beautifully slow breath in. And as you release it, let every last echo of the day drift away like a soft, silvery cloud vanishing into the dark. The journey is complete. The mountain is resting. The forest is quiet, and you have finally arrived at the heart of the deepest, most restorative sleep you have ever known. The night has tucked you in with its velvet, starlit blanket, and the world is entirely at peace. Everything is perfectly, beautifully, and completely still. Good night, and sleep deeply.